The greatest fortunes are often invisible to those who only know how to count coins. The outer edge of the Orion frontier was the last place anyone expected Destiny to arrive, wearing worn traveling clothes. Rust-colored dust drifted lazily through the narrow streets of Dock Settlement 9, while outdated cargo lifters groaned beneath containers that should have been retired decades earlier. Small repair shops leaned against one another beneath flickering neon signs, patched solar roofs, and tangled power cables that stretched across the settlement like spiderwebs. Every building carried the scars of survival rather than success. Here, people repaired broken engines instead of buying new ones. Here, every meal depended upon another honest day's work. Nathan Cole belonged to the place so completely that most people stopped noticing him. Every morning before sunrise, he unlocked the faded metal door of his tiny repair garage, rolled an old diagnostic cart onto the cracked landing pad, and waited for damaged cargo shuttles to arrive. His tools had been repaired more times than many of the ships he serviced. The sleeves of his dark gray work jacket carried permanent grease stains that refused to disappear no matter how often he washed them. Yet every bolt he tightened, every circuit he restored, and every engine he brought back to life reflected the same quiet care. Customers returned not because he was the fastest mechanic on the frontier, but because nothing ever left his workshop half-finished. Across the settlement, enormous display screens suddenly interrupted the ordinary morning with an unexpected transmission. Elegant alien symbols shimmered before translating into dozens of local languages. An honored visitor has arrived, the announcement declared. Curious workers stopped pushing cargo carts. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Children climbed onto stacked shipping crates for a better view of the landing field at the edge of town. Nathan barely glanced up before returning to the damaged coolant regulator resting on his workbench. Visitors came and went every month. Engines still needed fixing. Minutes later, a small silver shuttle descended gracefully onto the oldest landing pad in the settlement. Unlike luxury diplomatic vessels, it carried no royal banners, no escort fighters, and no official insignia. The hatch opened quietly. A young alien woman stepped onto the weathered metal platform, wearing simple traveling clothes that looked intentionally plain. Her blue skin shimmered softly beneath the morning sunlight. Long golden hair rested neatly across one shoulder, while oversized violet eyes with delicate six-point star-shaped pupils quietly studied the unfamiliar settlement around her. She carried only a small travel bag. No guards followed her. No servants greeted her. She looked less like someone important and more like a traveler searching for a place to belong. Curious whispers spread immediately. She is beautiful. She must be wealthy. Maybe she is looking for investors. The alien woman smiled politely at the gathering crowd before speaking in calm, flawless common speech. I came here for one reason. The entire landing field grew silent. I wish to choose one human. Confusion rippled through the settlement almost instantly. Several merchants hurried forward wearing their finest jackets. Business owners quickly introduced themselves. Local officials appeared carrying gifts they had never intended to give away that morning. Wealthy traders suddenly remembered charitable donations they had forgotten to mention for years. Every conversation seemed to become louder at once. Only one person remained exactly where he had been from the beginning. Nathan tightened the final bolt inside an old shuttle engine, wiped his hands with a faded cloth, and quietly reached for the next repair order waiting on the workbench. The alien woman noticed him immediately. While everyone else rushed toward her, the poorest mechanic in the settlement never once tried to get her attention. Nathan tightened the final connector inside the aging shuttle engine until the familiar click told him everything aligned perfectly. Only then did he finally straighten his back and wipe the grease from his hands with a faded blue shop towel that had long ago stopped becoming clean. Around him, the entire settlement buzzed with excitement. Wealthy traders rushed toward the mysterious alien visitor, carrying expensive gifts they had pulled from storage only moments earlier. Jewelry merchants displayed polished gemstones beneath portable lights. Cargo captains proudly pointed toward enormous transport vessels docked across the landing field. Even local officials suddenly remembered speeches about hospitality that none of them had practiced before that morning. Nathan simply looked at the repair invoice resting beside his toolbox. The customer would need the shuttle before sunset. Engines did not repair themselves while people chased interesting visitors. Across the crowded landing field, the young alien woman quietly observed everything without speaking. Her luminous violet eyes moved from smiling merchants to polished cargo ships before finally settling once more upon the small repair garage at the far edge of the settlement. The only human who had not approached her remained completely focused on repairing someone else's broken spacecraft. She smiled almost invisibly before adjusting the simple travel bag resting over one shoulder. An elderly trader stepped forward holding an ornate wooden case. "Miss," he said warmly, "allow me to welcome you with a small gift from Orion Station." Inside the box rested an expensive crystal necklace that immediately attracted admiring whispers from everyone nearby. The alien woman thanked him politely, but did not accept it. Another merchant quickly offered ownership shares in several profitable mining operations. A transport captain proudly invited her aboard his luxury cruiser. Someone even promised to build her a private residence overlooking the settlement within a week. She listened to every offer with quiet patience before asking only one question. "Which one of you repaired the shuttle that landed beside mine this morning?" Confused silence followed. Several merchants glanced toward the small repair garage at the end of the street. "Nathan fixed that one," somebody answered. "He repairs almost everything around here." The alien woman nodded gently. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, she walked away from the gathering crowd. She passed elegant gifts without slowing down. She ignored expensive vehicles and impressive introductions. Dust quietly settled around her boots as she crossed the old landing field toward the smallest workshop in the settlement. Nathan never noticed her approaching until a soft shadow fell across his workbench. He looked up from the open engine compartment, expecting another customer. Instead, he found himself looking into unusually kind violet eyes. "Good morning," she said with a gentle smile. Nathan returned the smile automatically. "Morning." She glanced toward the dismantled engine resting between them. "May I ask what you are repairing?" Nathan looked back at the machine. "Old coolant regulator." "Is it difficult?" "Only if you hurry." The answer seemed to amuse her. She quietly studied the scattered tools covering the workbench before pointing toward an adjustable wrench lying near the edge. "Would you like some help?" Nathan blinked once, uncertain he had heard correctly. Around them, nearly the entire settlement watched in stunned disbelief. The richest merchants in the district had been ignored. Yet the mysterious alien traveler now stood inside the Poorest repair garage asking a mechanic whether she could help tighten bolts. Nathan scratched the back of his neck awkwardly before handing her the wrench. "If you do not mind getting your hands dirty." Her smile immediately grew brighter. "I was hoping you would say that." Somewhere behind them, nobody noticed the expensive gifts still waiting unopened in the middle of the landing field. Nathan had expected the mysterious visitor to lose interest within 5 minutes. Most travelers who wandered into his workshop became bored the moment they discovered that repairing old cargo shuttles involved far more patience than excitement. Instead, the young alien woman rolled up the sleeves of her simple traveling jacket without the slightest complaint and carefully followed every instruction he gave her. She handed him tools exactly when he asked, organized replacement parts without being told twice, and listened more than she spoke. By midday, the repair bench looked cleaner than it had in months. Nathan glanced at her with quiet surprise while tightening another coolant valve. "You have done this before?" She smiled while wiping a thin layer of machine grease from her fingertips. "No," he raised an eyebrow. "Then you learn unusually fast." She looked thoughtfully at the scattered tools covering the workbench. "Maybe nobody ever gave me the chance before." Nathan simply nodded. He understood that answer better than she realized. Around the settlement, however, the strange scene had already become the only topic anyone wanted to discuss. Merchants stood outside expensive storefronts pretending to organize inventory while secretly watching the tiny repair garage across the street. Dock workers deliberately slowed their cargo vehicles each time they passed the workshop. Even children found excuses to run by the open entrance just to see whether the elegant alien traveler was still helping the poorest mechanic in the district. She was. An elderly woman carrying a basket of vegetables eventually stopped beside the garage door. "Nathan," she called warmly, "I baked too much bread again." Nathan smiled knowingly. "Mrs. Dawson, you always bake too much bread." She laughed. "And somehow you always forget to eat lunch." Before Nathan could answer, the old woman noticed the alien visitor. "You must be hungry too." Without waiting for permission, she placed a loaf of fresh bread and 2 apples onto the workbench before continuing down the street. The alien woman looked after her with genuine curiosity. "She gives you food?" Nathan shrugged. "Sometimes." "Do you pay her later?" He smiled while cutting the loaf into equal pieces. "She says good neighbors keep track of people instead of money." The alien woman accepted her half of the bread with both hands, as though receiving something precious. Your settlement is poor, she observed quietly. Nathan looked around the weathered workshop, the patched roof, and the aging ships waiting outside. Depends what you measure. She considered his answer while taking a small bite. It was the simplest meal she had eaten in years, yet she closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though trying to remember the taste forever. During the afternoon, another damaged shuttle rolled into the repair yard. The worried pilot climbed down carrying only a handful of worn credit chips. Nathan, he said apologetically, this is all I have until next month. Nathan counted the payment only long enough to realize it covered barely half the repair cost. He quietly returned several credits to the pilot. Buy food first, he said. We will settle the rest later. The pilot tried to protest, but Nathan had already walked toward the damaged engine. The alien woman watched everything in silence. You repaired his shuttle, she said softly after the pilot left. Yes, even though he could not afford it. Nathan looked genuinely confused by the question. He still needed to get home. She lowered her eyes toward the remaining piece of bread resting in her hands. Back on worlds where wealth filled every palace corridor, generosity often arrived attached to contracts, favors, or expectations. Here, in the poorest settlement she had ever visited, kindness seemed to appear as naturally as breathing. As the evening sun painted the docking yards with warm orange light, she quietly realized that the richest person she had met all day owned almost nothing that could be counted. Nathan locked the workshop just as the second sunset of Orion Frontier painted the sky with deep shades of orange and violet. The narrow streets of Dock Settlement 9 slowly grew quieter as repair crews finished their shifts and cargo traffic settled into its nighttime rhythm. Old transport lights reflected across puddles left by cooling systems, while distant engines hummed softly beyond the docking platforms. The young alien traveler remained standing outside the garage with her small travel bag resting beside her feet, looking uncertain for the first time since arriving that morning. Nathan noticed immediately. Do you already have somewhere to stay? She hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. Not yet. He glanced toward the crowded settlement where every inexpensive boarding house had probably filled before sunset. That might be difficult tonight. She nodded with a calm smile that tried to hide her disappointment. Nathan looked down the quiet street, thinking for only a few seconds. I have a spare room. She blinked once. You do? It is small. He shrugged, mostly because the rest of the building belongs to broken engines. She laughed softly. That sounds perfectly acceptable. Nathan picked up his old toolbox while she carried her travel bag, and together they walked through the settlement beneath rows of aging streetlights that flickered every few moments. Neighbors greeted Nathan warmly from front porches and open workshop doors. Children waved as they hurried home, carrying school tablets beneath their arms. An elderly mechanic repairing a bicycle called across the street. You finally hired someone? Nathan smiled. Only for one afternoon. The old man grinned knowingly before returning to his work. The alien woman quietly observed every greeting with growing fascination. Nobody treated Nathan as an important man. Nobody saluted him or bowed. They simply smiled because they genuinely seemed happy to see him. His home stood behind the repair garage, attached to the workshop by a narrow, covered walkway built from recycled cargo panels. Inside, everything looked modest but carefully maintained. A small kitchen occupied one corner beside a wooden table repaired so many times that almost every chair came from a different set. Shelves filled with engineering manuals lined one wall, while several flowering plants rested beside the only window overlooking the docking yards. Nothing appeared expensive. Everything appeared loved. Nathan set a cooking pot onto the small stove before opening the refrigerator. He paused briefly. There was not much inside. A few vegetables. Homemade soup from the previous evening. Half a loaf of bread. Fresh herbs growing in small containers near the window. He smiled apologetically. Dinner is simple. The alien woman looked around the cozy room. It already feels wonderful. Nathan quietly prepared the meal while she watched with genuine curiosity. May I help? She asked. He handed her a cutting board and several vegetables without hesitation. Soon both of them worked side by side in comfortable silence. Steam slowly filled the little kitchen while warm light reflected from old copper pans hanging above the counter. The smell of fresh soup drifted through the house. When everything was ready, Nathan divided the meal equally between two bowls. The portions were small. She noticed immediately that he had quietly given her the larger serving. You switched them, she said. Nathan looked genuinely confused. Switched what? She gently pushed one bowl back toward him. We should both have the same amount. Nathan smiled. Then we already do. She stared at him for a long moment before understanding. He truly did not measure generosity by what remained on his own plate. Outside, the docking lights shimmered beneath the evening sky while laughter drifted through the neighborhood from nearby homes. The young alien traveler slowly tasted the warm soup before looking around the tiny kitchen once more. She had eaten magnificent banquets beneath crystal ceilings. Yet somehow this simple meal shared inside the smallest house she had ever entered felt richer than any feast she could remember. Nathan never asked the young traveler why she had come to Dock Settlement 9. Days quietly blended into one another until the unusual became ordinary. Every morning, she helped unlock the workshop before sunrise. Every afternoon, she learned another small repair that no academy would ever consider important. Every evening, they carried leftover food to neighbors who needed it more than they did. The settlement slowly stopped treating her as a mysterious visitor and simply accepted her as part of everyday life. Nathan never introduced her with grand titles because he did not know any. When customers asked who she was, he simply answered, "A friend helping around the shop." Somehow that seemed enough. One cloudy afternoon, an elderly cargo pilot arrived, pushing a small anti-gravity cart loaded with broken equipment. His transport refrigeration unit had completely failed during a long delivery, ruining most of the food he had hoped to sell. He stood quietly beside the damaged machine, obviously embarrassed. "Nathan," he said softly, "I know I still owe you from last month." Nathan opened the service panel without looking up. "We will worry about that later. I really cannot pay today." Nathan nodded, as though discussing the weather. "Then today is free." The old pilot lowered his eyes. "You cannot keep doing this." Nathan smiled while reaching for a diagnostic scanner. "Apparently I can." The young alien traveler watched the exchange without saying a word. Later, while Nathan replaced several worn connectors inside the refrigeration system, she quietly asked, "How often does that happen?" Nathan looked genuinely puzzled. "What? People unable to pay?" He shrugged. "More often than they would like." "And you still repair everything?" "If I do not, somebody loses a job, misses dinner, or cannot get home." He tightened the final connector before continuing. "Machines are easier to fix than broken lives." She carried those words with her for the rest of the afternoon. As sunset approached, several neighborhood children gathered outside the workshop holding a small cardboard box filled with cracked toy drones and broken learning tablets. "Mr. Nathan," one little girl asked hopefully, "do you think these still work?" Nathan smiled. "Probably." The children cheered. Without another thought, he pulled several chairs into the workshop while the young traveler sat beside him, sorting tiny screws into careful rows. Together, they spent hours repairing old toys instead of expensive engines. Every time another small drone hummed back to life, the children celebrated as though they had discovered hidden treasure. The young traveler laughed more during those 2 hours than she had since arriving on the frontier. Long after the children ran home carrying repaired toys beneath the evening sky, she quietly placed the final screwdriver onto the workbench. "Back where I come from," she admitted softly. "Children receive new things whenever something breaks." Nathan gently closed the toolbox. "Sometimes fixing something teaches you to appreciate it." She looked around the tiny workshop, glowing beneath warm yellow lights. Every shelf contained repaired equipment. Every chair had been mended. Every cup in the kitchen carried small cracks, carefully sealed instead of replaced. Even the old sign above the garage door had been painted so many times that the original lettering no longer existed beneath the fresh coat. Nothing inside the little building was perfect. Everything inside had been given another chance. She suddenly realized that Nathan treated people exactly the same way. Outside, the stars slowly appeared above the frontier settlement, while distant cargo ships crossed the dark sky toward worlds far richer than this forgotten place. Yet as she stood quietly beside the poorest mechanic in the galaxy, surrounded by repaired machines, grateful neighbors, and simple kindness, she found herself wondering whether wealth had been misunderstood by almost everyone she had ever known. The peaceful rhythm of Dock Settlement 9 changed just after sunrise on the 7th morning. Nathan was repairing the guidance system of an aging cargo shuttle, while the young traveler carefully organized replacement parts across the workbench exactly as she had learned during the previous week. She no longer hesitated before choosing the correct tool. She no longer looked uncertain carrying heavy equipment across the workshop. The neighbors had quietly accepted her presence until it felt as though she had always belonged there. Then every communication screen across the settlement suddenly turned bright silver. Cargo traffic slowed. Shop owners stepped outside. Children stopped chasing one another through the narrow streets. A single unfamiliar symbol appeared upon every public display, elegant and unmistakably royal. Nathan barely noticed at first. He remained focused on tightening a damaged guidance relay before reconnecting the final power conduit. The shuttle's navigation lights immediately returned to life. There, he said with quiet satisfaction. That should last another 10 years if nobody flies through an asteroid field. The pilot laughed gratefully before climbing aboard. Only after the shuttle lifted away did Nathan realize the entire street had become strangely silent. He looked up. Every person around him was staring toward the sky. High above Dock Settlement 9, dozens of enormous silver starships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. Their polished hulls reflected the morning sunlight, while blue energy shields shimmered gently around each vessel. They were unlike cargo ships or military cruisers. Their graceful designs carried unmistakable royal insignia glowing across the sides. The young traveler quietly lowered the wrench she had been holding. For the first time since arriving, the warmth disappeared from her expression. Nathan noticed immediately. "Do you know them?" She answered almost too softly to hear. "Yes." Before he could ask another question, elegant landing craft descended through the clouds toward the settlement with remarkable precision. They touched down without raising dust, their engines whispering instead of roaring. Rows of ceremonial guards stepped onto the weathered landing pads wearing silver armor that reflected the frontier's sun like flowing water. None of them looked toward the merchants or local officials gathering nearby. Every one of them searched only for a single person. An elderly woman dressed in magnificent sapphire ceremonial robes emerged from the central shuttle, carrying an ornate crystal staff. The entire settlement instinctively fell silent. The woman looked slowly across the crowd before her eyes settled upon the young traveler, standing beside Nathan's workbench. Without hesitation, she placed one hand across her heart and lowered her head in a formal bow. Every royal guard followed instantly. Hundreds of armored figures bowed together in perfect silence. The frontier settlement froze. Nathan stared at the unbelievable scene without understanding. The old woman finally spoke, her voice carrying naturally across the quiet street. "Your Highness," she said gently, "the Imperial Council has searched every known system for you." No one breathed. The words echoed through the settlement like distant thunder. Nathan slowly turned toward the young woman who had shared bread, repaired engines, and carried toolboxes beside him every day. She stood perfectly still, sadness filling her luminous violet eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I wanted a little more time before you knew." Around them, wealthy merchants who had once tried to impress the mysterious visitor now dropped silently to one knee. Local officials bowed their heads. Even the children who had laughed with her outside the workshop stared in speechless disbelief. Nathan looked from the royal fleet filling the sky back to the woman he thought he knew. The grease still staining her borrowed work shirt suddenly mattered far more to him than the impossible title everyone else had just spoken aloud. The poorest mechanic in the galaxy finally understood why the stranger who had asked for a wrench had never once behaved like someone searching for wealth. She had spent the last week quietly escaping a kingdom. Sua Nathan looked at the royal fleet filling the morning sky before quietly setting the wrench back onto the workbench exactly where it belonged. Around him the settlement remained frozen beneath a silence so complete that even the old cargo cranes seemed to stop moving. Merchants who had spent days trying to impress the mysterious traveler now remained kneeling with lowered heads. Children who had laughed with her outside the repair shop held tightly to the repaired toys she had helped fix only the day before. The elderly royal advisor waited patiently, still bowing before. Elora departed that afternoon beneath a sky filled with silver royal starships. Yet Dock Settlement 9 did not celebrate the spectacle. The neighbors stood quietly along the weathered streets, waving not to a princess but to the young woman who had shared bread, repaired engines, and laughed with their children. Nathan remained beside the old repair garage with one hand resting on the faded workshop door until the final shuttle disappeared beyond the clouds. Then he simply rolled the diagnostic cart back into place and returned to work. The next morning looked almost exactly like every morning before she had arrived. Cargo pilots lined up outside the workshop carrying broken engines. Mrs. Dawson delivered another loaf of fresh bread. Children hurried past on their way to school. Life continued because ordinary people rarely had the luxury of stopping for very long. Yet something inside the settlement had quietly changed. People who had once measured success by larger cargo contracts now spent more time helping neighbors repair damaged roofs. Merchants began leaving food outside homes where elderly residents lived alone. Mechanics shared spare parts instead of competing over every customer. Nobody announced a new tradition. It simply spread from one small act of kindness to another. Nearly 3 weeks later, every communication screen across the frontier activated simultaneously. Nathan looked up from beneath an engine compartment, wiping grease from his hands before stepping outside with dozens of curious neighbors. The Imperial Palace appeared across every display. Crystal towers stretched toward brilliant blue skies, while thousands of dignitaries gathered beneath banners representing every world within the empire. At the center of the Great Hall stood Elora, wearing magnificent sapphire ceremonial robes that reflected the light like flowing water. Yet something immediately caught Nathan's attention. Resting over her royal attire was the simple leather tool belt she had borrowed from his workshop. The old scratches were still visible. The entire settlement smiled at once. The Master of Ceremonies formally announced the beginning of the succession address. Elora stepped forward alone. For many generations, she began, our empire believed prosperity came from collecting wealth. She paused, looking directly toward the countless cameras broadcasting her words across the galaxy. I have recently discovered that true wealth is measured differently. Murmurs spread through the assembled nobles. She continued calmly. I spent 7 days among the poorest human settlement I have ever visited. Several members of the Imperial Council exchanged uneasy glances. There I met families who repaired instead of replacing, neighbors who shared instead of counting, and one mechanic who gave away the little he possessed without expecting anything in return. Nathan quietly lowered his eyes. He felt strangely uncomfortable hearing his own life described before an entire empire. Elora smiled gently. Many believed I chose the poorest human in the galaxy. Her luminous violet eyes reflected quiet certainty. That was never true. The magnificent hall fell completely silent. I chose the richest heart I could find. Even the Imperial Council remained speechless. She slowly removed the leather tool belt and placed it across the ceremonial throne instead of wearing the traditional royal sash prepared for her coronation. Beginning today, she declared, every imperial heir will spend 1 year living among ordinary citizens before accepting the crown. No ruler will govern people they have never truly lived beside. Across Dock Settlement 9, neighbors looked toward Nathan with expressions of quiet pride. He only smiled faintly before picking up the wrench lying beside his toolbox. The oldest mechanic in the settlement laughed softly. Looks like your apprentice just changed an empire. Nathan glanced toward the workshop where her borrowed coffee mug still rested on the shelf exactly where she had left it. No, he answered gently. She changed it herself. She only needed someone to remind her what was already inside. Many years passed before another royal shuttle landed on the weathered platform outside Nathan's little repair garage. Dock Settlement 9 had grown busier over time, but it had never become wealthy. The streets still carried the familiar scent of machine oil, fresh bread, and warm metal cooling beneath the evening sky. The repair shop looked almost exactly as it always had. The old sign still leaned slightly to one side. The same workbench remained covered with carefully organized tools polished by years of honest use. Children who had once watched Nathan repair their toy drones now brought their own sons and daughters to learn how to tighten bolts and rebuild worn engines. Some things changed slowly because they had never been broken in the first place. Nathan looked up from beneath the open engine compartment of an aging transport shuttle as the graceful silver craft settled quietly onto the landing pad. He smiled before the landing ramp had even finished lowering. He recognized it immediately. Elora stepped onto the dusty frontier street wearing elegant sapphire traveling clothes rather than imperial robes. She carried no jeweled crown, no ceremonial staff, and no long procession of attendants. Only one elderly advisor followed several respectful steps behind before stopping beside the shuttle. The old woman smiled warmly. Her Majesty insisted on walking the rest of the way herself. Nathan wiped his hands with the same faded blue shop towel he had used for years. Some habits are difficult to forget. Elora laughed softly. Some habits are worth keeping. Neither of them hurried forward. Neither spoke dramatic words. They simply stood smiling at one another across the familiar workshop entrance where everything important had quietly begun. After a long moment, Nathan looked toward the old coffee mug still resting on the shelf near the window. I never moved it. Elora followed his gaze before smiling with unmistakable affection. I hoped you would not. They spent the afternoon exactly as they had years earlier. They repaired a damaged coolant pump together, shared fresh bread delivered by Mrs. Dawson's grandchildren, helped a young mechanic solve a difficult engine problem, walked through the neighborhood greeting people who welcomed Elora not as their empress, but as the friend who once carried toolboxes beside Nathan without ever asking to be treated differently. As evening settled across the settlement, they climbed the small hill overlooking the docking yards where cargo ships departed beneath an endless field of stars. The lights of the frontier shimmered below, while distant transports crossed quietly toward worlds scattered throughout the galaxy. Elora looked across the humble settlement before speaking. "Do you remember the day everyone believed I chose the poorest human in the galaxy?" Nathan smiled. "I remember thinking they were paying far too much attention to my workshop." She laughed before becoming thoughtful again. "They were wrong." Nathan glanced toward her. "About what?" She looked toward the homes glowing warmly beneath the evening sky. "They measured wealth by what people owned." Her luminous violet eyes reflected the stars one by one. "I measured it by what people gave away without expecting anything in return." Nathan said nothing. Some truths did not need another sentence. Far below them, neighbors gathered for dinner, children chased one another through quiet streets, and repaired cargo ships lifted peacefully toward the heavens. None of them noticed the Empress standing beside the mechanic because to them she had never truly left. At the entrance to Dock Settlement 9, visitors eventually discovered a simple wooden sign built by the people who lived there. It carried no royal crest and no official decree. Only a single sentence had been carefully carved into the weathered wood. The greatest wealth was never measured in gold. It was measured by the heart willing to share its last piece of bread. Every traveler who read those words looked toward the little repair garage at the end of the street where an old mechanic still fixed broken things one careful bolt at a time. And somewhere beyond the stars, an entire empire quietly remembered that its greatest treasure had never been hidden inside a palace. It had once been found inside the smallest workshop in the poorest corner of the galaxy.